Before we check out the Falcons roster projection from ESPN, you guys know I love to look at the analytics on YouTube. And in the month of July, Falcons Today has a little under 6,000 subscribers. Meanwhile, Saints Now has nearly 2,000 more, likes, not subscribers. I wish we had this many subscribers in the month of July. But they have 2,000 more likes in the month of July. So make sure to like the video, not just today, but every time you click on one of our videos. We're going to check out ESPN's roster projection with training camp just getting underway. Felt like a good time to kind of peek at who they have making the 53-man roster. We're also looking at some of the surprise and notable omissions and cuts that were made. So let's go in the most logical football chronological order from offense to defense, kind of front to back. So we'll start with Kirk Cousins and the rest of the quarterback room, where this is done by Mark Ramiondi. He's the new Falcons ESPN beat reporter. He has Kirk Cousins, Michael Penix Jr., and Taylor Heinicke making the 53-man roster. Overall, not too surprising by this. You could argue Heinicke won't make it, but the fact that the Falcons reworked his contract and he agreed to a pay cut to stay with the team, I think there's some motivation to have three quarterbacks on their roster while Cousins works his way back from an injury. Moving on to the running backs, Bijan, Tyler Allgeier, Jace McClellan, and Avery Williams. No big surprises here in terms of omissions or cuts. Maybe a little bit of a surprise about someone who made the roster, which is sixth-round draft pick out of Alabama, Jace McClellan. I think that the former Crimson Tide back has some work to do. We didn't get to see him at all during the spring. Remember at Alabama, he suffered an injury. I think it was in the Iron Bowl, and then he missed the first. No, I don't remember if he missed the first college football playoff game, but regardless, that did knock him out for a lot of the pre-draft workout stuff, and as a result, I think he fell to day 3 of the draft. So he's got some work to do to prove that he's worthy of a spot on the roster. Last year for Alabama, for the Alabama Crimson Tide standards, it didn't really live up to it. I know that's a really high bar and unfair to him for averaging nearly 5 yards a carry, but I think if you ask an Alabama fan in your life, that the bar was probably a little bit higher for him and didn't quite exceed it. So I'd be a little surprised if he were to make the 53-man roster, just because I think there's going to be a lot of dosage and usage going to Bijan Robinson that they may not feel like they need to carry 4 running backs. Wide receiver, 6 made the roster. Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Rondale Moore, Ray-Ray McCloud, KhaDarel Hodge, and Casey Washington. This is relatively chalk. There's no one on that list that shouldn't be on that list, and there's no one that's not on that list that should be on that list. The Falcons don't have a very deep wide receiver room, so I expect, if healthy, the top 6 guys, which I just listed, all to make the roster. KhaDarel Hodge can be a really good special tool on special teams. Same with Ray-Ray McCloud. Casey Washington, a rookie, they're not going to cut him. So for me, it's pretty chalk, and I expect it to go that way when roster cutdown day gets here. Moving on to the tight ends, Kyle Pitts, Charlie Woerner, and Ross Dwelley. So this part right here is a little bit not surprising, but I won't say concerning, but maybe a little concerning. The tight end room is lacking some depth when it comes to experienced receivers. You combine Charlie Woerner and Ross Dwelley's receptions, over their careers, they've got a combined 10 years of service and 55 grabs. If something were to happen to Kyle Pitts, there is not another receiving tight end on this roster. So there are some bets being made on Kyle Pitts staying healthy this year, and hopefully he can. But if something were to happen to the unicorn, we're going to see a new version of Charlie Woerner or Ross Dwelley that we haven't seen before. Now, who do you think will have more yards this season? Darnell Mooney or Kyle Pitts? I could see them being very close. Sure, Darnell Mooney the last 2 years was below 500 yards each season, but in his second season, he went over 1,000 yards, which Kyle Pitts has not gotten to since his rookie season. So who do you think will have more yards this year? Darnell Mooney or Kyle Pitts? Onto the offensive line. Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Drew Dalman, Chris Lindstrom, Kaleb McGary, of course. And then there are 4 backups: Storm Norton, Kyle Hinton, Ryan Neuzil, and Tyler Vrabel. That is pretty expected, I'd say. There's no one that shouldn't be on that list or no one that should be on that list. Overall, the offensive line, though, is the strength of this team. Like, it is the what did Michael say in The Office when talking about the Titanic on the riverboat cruise? Like, it's the guys in the furnace feeding it coal. Like, the offensive line is what makes this team go. It is a top 5 unit in the NFL. I don't think there is a single other unit on the Falcons roster that can make that argument. I mean, look at the offensive line rankings from numerous well-respected football outlets. Warren Sharp Football Analysis, he has them as the second best offensive line. Pro Football Network, 5th best. Pro Football Focus, 6th. The Huddle, 6th. Establish the Run, 6th. We're talking about out of 32 teams, the floor for this offensive line is 6, and I think it's much closer to 2 than 6. So this is the number 1 unit on this entire Falcons roster. It's got to stay healthy because it what makes the offense go. All right, before we look at the defensive side of the football now, today's show is sponsored by Game Time. If you love summer baseball and want to catch a Braves game or any other major league team, you're going to want to give Game Time a shot. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. Now, one thing I really like about Game Time is the Game Time guarantee. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code CHAT SPORTS for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Switching gears to the defensive line now. Let's go look at the Falcons defensive line roster as they've got Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Zach Harrison, then rookie Ruka Rororo, and then fellow rookie Brandon Dorlus, and two-time retiree Eddie Goldman, and recent draft pick Taquan Graham, along with recent-ish draft pick, but much more recent free agent signing James Smith-Williams making the roster. So altogether, 8 defensive linemen for a 3-4 defense. So clearly a lot of investment on that part of the defense. Some notable omissions here. Defensive tackle Kentavious Street. That's someone the Falcons traded for at the trade deadline from the Eagles after Grady Jarrett went down. They re-signed him this offseason. He played well for Atlanta before he got injured. So I think he's got a pretty good chance of making this roster. They brought him back for a reason. And then rookie tackle, defensive tackle Zion Logue. 6th-round draft pick. And sure, not all 7th and 6th-round draft picks are locked to make their rosters like most 1 through 5 draft picks are. But I thought Zion Logue had a pretty good chance of making the initial 53-man roster just because the Falcons are clearly going for a young defensive line. That's been reflected in all their draft picks. So why not keep all those young defensive linemen together? So I wouldn't be surprised to see one of these guys take Taquan Graham or maybe even Eddie Goldman's spot. But like I said, Kentavious Street last year, I thought he was pretty good when he filled in for Grady Jarrett. 14 tackles, 4 tackles for loss, a sack, a fumble recovery. So hopefully Grady Jarrett is able to bounce back nicely. Another player that I think is kind of flying under the radar a little bit, Eddie Goldman. We have not seen him since 2021. Remember, at the end of the 2021 season, he signed with the Falcons. He decided to retire shortly after, missed all of 2022. After the 2022 season, he decides, I actually do want to play. Comes out of retirement. Just like 2 weeks later, he retires, misses all of 2023. And here we are getting ready for the 2024 season. Eddie Goldman, since 2020, has played 1 year and just 14 games, too. But before that, for the Chicago Bears, where he played his entire career, he was one of the best true nose tackle, interior defensive linemen. The guy is 330-plus pounds, and he can still get after the quarterback. Those are tough players to find, which is why you can see the Falcons were happy to bring him back out of retirement for another time. So if the Falcons can get Eddie Goldman on this roster and keep him on this roster, I mean, it's going to be a really fun interior defensive line. That, paired with David Onyemata, that's a lot of experience and some big dudes. I mean, not just from a pass rushing standpoint, which David Onyemata is one of the better pass rushing kind of nose tackle, maybe not just true nose tackle, but, defensive tackles in football. But if you can get a rotation of two experienced 300-pound plus defensive tackles, it's not impossible to find 300-pound plus defensive tackles in the league. They're everywhere, but it's tough to find good ones, and it's tough to find experienced ones. So if they can get Eddie Goldman back to where he was in 2018, 2019 with the Bears, which was 5, 6, 7 years ago, so, pretty far behind them. But if they can do that, man, imagine what that's going to do to alleviate some of the pressure and stress placed on Onyemata to play first, second, and third down at a high level for 4 quarters for 17 weeks. Instead, he could take a little bit of a breather on 1st and 10, have Eddie Goldman go out there for the run. Then when 3rd and 10 rolls around, get David Onyemata out there fresh in the 4th quarter. You may not have some great edge rushers coming off the edge, but you're going to have some really good interior defensive linemen creating pressure. And where do quarterbacks hate getting pressure from the most? Right up the middle. On to the linebackers. 7 linebackers on the roster. Arnold Ebiketie, Caden Ellis, Troy Anderson, Lorenzo Carter, Nate Landman, JT Bertrand, and Braylon Trice. A lot like the rest of the roster, very chalk and very expected. I am excited, though, for the linebacker duel between Troy Anderson and Nate Landman. On day one of training camp, we saw more of Nate Landman with the first team defense, but I expect to see a good rotation. Troy Anderson was really exciting coming out of Montana, and unfortunately an injury early in 2023 cut his season short. Landman did an excellent job of filling in. Wasn't just a good run stopper. The guy was the second best playmaker on this defense after Jesse Bates. 3 forced fumbles, an interception, 2 sacks. So I think it's going to be really tough for Atlanta to take Nate Landman off the field. Trivia for today's episode. I've got 3 quarterbacks for you. I want you to put them in order of career earnings from most to least. Ben Roethlisberger, Matty Ice, Phillip Rivers. Put their career earnings in order from most to least. We will reveal the answer at the end of the show. As for the corners, A.J. Terrell, Mike Hughes, Clark Phillips, Antonio Hamilton, Kevin King, and D. Alford. This is relatively chalk as well, and I know I've said that a lot, but when you look closer at Atlanta's cornerback room, find me someone else that's more likely to make the roster than those 6 guys. Like, you can make arguments for some other players, but I don't think anyone can say anything they would put money down on to say this guy's going to make it over Kevin King for sure. Ultimately, I look at Terrell, Phillips, and Alford as locks to make the roster. And then the next 3 cornerback spots, it's an absolute rock fight. Antonio Hamilton probably has the biggest rock of them all because he's got some experience and he played some good football last year for Arizona. But everyone else, best of luck. It is mano y mano y mano. It is Fortnite for cornerback. So we'll find out who emerges, but this is definitely going to be one of the most competitive rooms for the next 5 weeks. And then finally, the safeties. 4 safeties on the roster: Jesse Bates, DeMarco Hellams, Richie Grant, and Micah Abernathy. We know what Bates is capable of. DeMarco Hellams and Richie Grant are competing for a starting gig, and Micah Abernathy is the best on special teams of all the other safeties, so that's how he finds his way onto this roster. But let me just take 30 seconds to appreciate how awesome Jesse Bates is. Last year for the Falcons, 132 tackles, 6 tackles for loss, 3 interceptions, 6 forced fumbles, and 1 touchdown. It sounds like a Christmas song, like just one after another. So Jesse Bates, just your weekly reminder, the dude's a stud, and the Falcons are so lucky to have him. So some notable and surprise cuts, if you will. John Fitzpatrick out of the tight end room, drafted not too many years ago. Kentavious Street, like we talked about, same for Zion Logue. D'Angelo Malone, he was just a third-round pick also 2-3 years ago. He was not on that roster. And then I'm going to include Bradley Anae. I didn't think he'd be considered a surprise cut, but there were a lot of good reports about him back in the spring. So with only 7 linebackers, maybe he could try and sneak on and force them to take 8, but it would be between him and him and D'Angelo Malone. All right, so that will do it for us on today's show. But first, we got to reveal our trivia answer. Ben Roethlisberger, Matt Ryan, Phillip Rivers, most career earnings. Get your guesses in right now. We're going to reveal the answer in about 5 seconds. But let me know from most to least who's got the most money after their NFL career. The answer coming up in 3, 2, 1. Matty Ice with $303.7 million. Ben Roethlisberger with $267 million. And Phillip Rivers coming in at $243 million. This is also just a reminder of, if you played football 10 years ago, man, did you miss out on some great money. And for the guys playing football in 10 years, they're going to have some great money. The NFL as a business is just booming.